There's a difference between authority and control. Authority is earned through reason, fairness, and the quiet dignity of leadership. Control, on the other hand, is fear disguised in rules. My story begins in a neighborhood that looks serene on the outside. Uniform lawns, matching mailboxes, weekly newsletters in pastel colors, but was tightly gripped by a woman who had confused power with purpose. Her name was Karen Hartley, and she was the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek Estates. I never cared much for HOA drama. I bought my house after retiring from a physically demanding job, aiming for peace and a place to manage my health in quiet dignity. I didn't expect a battlefield. I was diagnosed with a serious autoimmune disorder 2 years ago. Among other things, it affected my lungs and kidneys, requiring me to be hooked up to machines several times a week. A home dialysis setup had been installed in my guest room, and an oxygen concentrator helped stabilize me during attacks. Most people don't see the fear that comes with needing these machines. The fragility of knowing your life depends on electricity flowing uninterrupted through a tangle of sterile plastic tubes. That's why, after consulting with my doctor and a medical tech advisor, I invested in a backup generator. It wasn't flashy or noisy, just a reliable unit installed behind my garage, soundproofed and HOA compliant. Or so I thought. Karen made herself known the very next morning after it was installed. She showed up at my door in her usual uniform. Crisp white tennis skirt, clipboard, aviator sunglasses that she never removed, not even in the shade. Her voice had the brittle cheer of someone suppressing a lifetime of anger under a smile. "Hello. I noticed you had something installed yesterday. I don't recall seeing an approval request." I explained the situation calmly. I even showed her the physician's note, the building permit, and the model number, which fell within HOA noise and placement regulations. But she didn't care. Karen wasn't looking for facts. She was looking for compliance. "This sort of thing sets a precedent," she said with a sigh, eyes scanning the street like she was already imagining a dozen backup generators springing up like weeds. "It affects property values. It's disruptive." To whom? I thought. The squirrels? She left that day with a warning, not a resolution. The first letter came 2 days later, a formal complaint from the HOA board citing unauthorized equipment on property grounds. Then a second letter, then a fine. At first, I paid them, thinking it would buy peace. It didn't. Karen thrived on escalation. She began photographing my yard, citing violations for things like a garden hose left uncoiled or excessively decorative wind chimes. She once left a note about my grass being 1/4 inch above regulation length. I started documenting everything, dates, letters, photos. Not because I feared her, but because I could sense the line she was inching toward. She didn't just want rules followed, she wanted obedience. And then came the surgery. It was a serious procedure, one that required a long prep and careful recovery at home. The risks were substantial, but it had to be done. My doctor coordinated with a nurse who would check on me for the first few days, and I was set to come home with drains, oxygen, and mobility limitations. My generator was checked twice, both by the installer and my nurse. Everything was set. Karen, of course, didn't like the increase in activity around my home. She stood outside one morning while a delivery arrived, arms crossed, glaring at the nurse's vehicle like it was some foreign invasion. "You're not turning this into a hospital," she said when I stepped outside. "No," I said flatly. "I'm trying to stay out of one." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something in the air had shifted. You can sense it when someone moves from irritation to resentment, when their obsession with control turns inward and starts boiling. I kept the curtains drawn and the porch light on. The next morning, my nurse arrived early. She was the one who found the power out, not just the lights, but the entire line from the grid severed. She found burn marks on the casing near the fuse box. My backup generator was dead, wires clipped. That moment was more than shocking. It was surreal. I'd seen neighbors complain, seen pettiness. But this was sabotage. Panic set in. My oxygen machine had a backup battery, but it was limited. My chest tightened, not from my condition, but from the realization that someone had deliberately tried to hurt me. I was due at the hospital in 4 hours. If I hadn't caught it early, if my nurse hadn't shown up, I might have been unconscious by then. Or worse, the fire department came first, then the police. The responding officer was a man named Brooks, calm, steady, the kind who listens without judgment. He inspected the damage, reviewed my generator permit, and nodded slowly. "This isn't vandalism," he said. "It's targeted." Then the neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Joel who kept to himself, came forward. He'd seen Karen behind my house around midnight, holding bolt cutters and a flashlight. He hadn't wanted to get involved before. But now, with emergency services swarming, he stepped up. "She told me it was routine maintenance," he said. But I knew something was off. Karen was arrested 2 hours later. Not just for trespassing or property damage, but under a rarely used statute, medical sabotage. When you deliberately disable life-sustaining equipment with intent to cause harm, it becomes more than a neighborhood dispute. It becomes a criminal offense. I'll never forget the look on her face when the officers led her away. Not fear, not regret, but disbelief. Like she couldn't comprehend that her rules didn't apply here. Like she'd lost a game she never imagined she could lose. I stood there, wrapped in my jacket, the sun rising over the chaos she'd caused. And for the first time in months, I felt something that had almost vanished from my life. Safety. Not because justice was served yet, but because I finally understood what I was fighting for. Karen's arrest sent a shockwave through the pristine rows of Willow Creek Estates. For a place that prided itself on order, appearance, and controlled calm, seeing its queen pin and handcuffs shattered something deeper than any broken HOA regulation ever could. I watched from my front window, still groggy from the night's ordeal, my nurse by my side, one hand on my shoulder, as the neighbors gathered in quiet, awkward clumps. Most didn't say anything. A few whispered. One woman gasped loud enough for me to hear, clutching her robe as if the neighborhood had just been desecrated. But no one came to my door. No one asked if I was okay. Not yet. Karen, even in arrest, tried to maintain her authority. She kept her chin high, her clipboard. Yes, she had it even then, tucked beneath her arm as if she could file a citation against the officers mid-arrest. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She just looked insulted, as if someone had finally had the audacity to question her divine right to rule. I spent the next 3 days recovering from surgery. The procedure went well, physically at least, but the emotional weight made everything heavier. I was supposed to be focused on rest, healing, breath work, and nutrition. Instead, my phone buzzed constantly. Reporters, neighbors, board members. Some expressed concern. Others danced around the subject, pretending they were just checking in. I didn't respond. I had already handed everything over to Officer Brooks and the prosecutor assigned to the case. My only focus was regaining strength. But trauma doesn't wait. It eats at you when the painkillers wear off and the house gets too quiet. Then came the letter, not from Karen, of course, but from her attorney. A boilerplate attempt to frame the entire incident as a misunderstanding. She hadn't cut the power maliciously, the letter claimed. She had simply believed there was a fire hazard. She had been acting in the interest of neighborhood safety. There was no mention of the bolt cutters. No mention of the severed oxygen machine line. No mention of Joel's witness testimony. It was insulting, but also revealing. Karen wasn't scared. She was confident. That arrogance carried into the first court appearance. The room was small, county-level courtroom with plastic seats and an old wood bench that creaked when a judge sat down. Karen walked in wearing a pastel suit and pearls, like she was headed to a fundraiser, not a felony arraignment. Her lawyer spoke first, trying to minimize the charge. She was concerned, he said, with that oily calm lawyers use when they know they're reaching. Concerned for safety. Concerned for code compliance. My client has served this community for 12 years and has only acted with its best interest in mind. The prosecutor didn't flinch. She laid out the facts. Illegal trespass, unauthorized tampering with electrical systems, direct sabotage of medically essential equipment, and witness testimony that placed Karen at the scene in the middle of the night. There was also photo evidence, scorch marks, clipped wiring, and tool impressions matching those found in Karen's shed. A direct chain of cause and effect. Karen showed no emotion through any of it, except when the judge refused to dismiss the charges. Then her jaw tightened, the mask cracked, Outside the courtroom, the HOA members stood in a loose cluster. They didn't know what to say. Most looked uncomfortable, as if just standing near me was a political act. One of them, Melissa, a woman who always wore lavender and hosted wine nights, finally broke away and approached me. "I had no idea it had gotten this bad," she said, voice low. "She told us it was just about a noise violation. None of us knew you were sick. We didn't know she'd gone that far." I nodded. I didn't blame her. Not entirely. Karen had always been the puppet master, and the rest of them had been too comfortably blind to question her strings. But that was changing now. The illusion was breaking. Over the next few weeks, the tide turned slowly, like a long-awaited thaw after a bitter winter. Joel spoke out in a neighborhood meeting. Then another neighbor admitted Karen had once threatened to fine her for having too many guests over during a holiday. Another man said she'd try to have his kid's bike ramp removed for property degradation. Stories spilled out like cracks forming in a dam. The HOA board was suddenly on defense. They issued a public statement suspending Karen from her duties pending investigation. The newsletter stopped. Fines were paused. A sense of temporary peace settled over the neighborhood, one that felt strange, almost hollow. People began waving at me when I walked outside. Someone left a casserole. A child chalked a get-well-soon message on the sidewalk in front of my home. But Karen wasn't done. She filed a countersuit, civil this time, accusing me of defamation and emotional distress. She claimed I had weaponized my condition to damage her reputation. Her lawyer painted her as a misunderstood patriot of neighborhood order. The lawsuit was weak, clearly retaliatory, and my legal counsel moved to dismiss it immediately. Still, it was a reminder. Bullies don't go quietly. Not when they've tasted power for years. The criminal case pressed forward. I had to give testimony, something I dreaded. Not because I was afraid of her, but because saying it all aloud made it real. The night of the power cut, the panic, the clipped wires, it stopped being an event and became a wound I had to reopen under oath. I remember the prosecutor's question, "Did you believe your life was in danger that night?" "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "I did, and I believe she knew exactly what she was doing." Karen's lawyer objected. The judge overruled it. And in that moment, as the court stenographer typed the words I'd just spoken, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. The acknowledgement that what happened to me mattered. That it wasn't just a neighbor dispute. It was an assault on my dignity, my health, and my right to be safe in my own home. The media caught wind. A few local outlets ran headlines like, "HOA president accused of cutting power to sick resident's home," and "Medical sabotage case reveals tyranny behind suburban gates." The court sealed my medical records, but my name was out there now. People recognized me at the grocery store. Some were supportive. Others looked away. But the most telling shift came from within Willow Creek. At the next HOA emergency meeting, a vote was held. Karen's presidency was revoked. The board dissolved itself temporarily and formed a community-led task force to reevaluate every bylaw Karen had passed in the last 5 years. Almost all of them were frozen. Some were eliminated outright. It was a cleansing. Still, I wasn't celebrating. The damage was done. I had sleepless nights, muscle tension, dreams of lights going out and alarms blaring. But with each small step toward justice, each day Karen spent on house arrest, each hearing where her excuses fell flat, I felt stronger. Karen never apologized. Not in court, not in writing, not once. She clung to her story, convinced she had been the true victim. That narrative shattered at her sentencing hearing, which I attended, sitting in the front row with Joel and Melissa behind me. The judge called it an unprecedented abuse of civic power. She was sentenced to 90 days in county jail, with 2 years of probation, and ordered to pay restitution for medical damages and emotional distress. She was also banned from holding any HOA position in the state for 5 years. When they led her away that day, there were no sunglasses, no clipboard, just a woman stripped of her self-made throne. I exhaled, not because the fight was over, but because I'd won the part that mattered. I'd stood up not just for myself, but for everyone who had been silenced by petty tyranny and passive complicity. I had reminded them all that there are lines you do not cross. Not for power, not for rules, not for control, not when a life is on the line. Healing isn't a moment. It's a series of silent decisions you make every day. To keep going, to get out of bed even when your chest still aches, to breathe through the memory instead of letting it own you. After Karen's sentencing, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, like I had just finished fighting a war I never wanted, and now I was standing among the ruins of something that used to be my life. The physical recovery from surgery was ongoing, but the emotional repair was something else entirely. Nights were the hardest. Even with Karen gone, I still woke up at odd hours, jolted by imagined silence, convinced that the oxygen machine had stopped again. I'd check it, hand trembling, even when I knew everything was fine. Trauma doesn't care about logic. It lives in the body. Still, something in the neighborhood had changed, and it wasn't just that Karen's clipboard was finally missing from the sidewalks. It was the quiet, not the oppressive quiet that once hung over Willow Creek like a storm cloud, but a gentle, peaceful silence. A neighbor across the street, Joel, the same man who had testified against her, began waving at me every morning. People I had never spoken to before stopped by to drop off soup, flowers, or just ask how I was doing. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I'd been so used to being left alone, ignored, tolerated, or scrutinized. Now suddenly I mattered. My pain mattered. The HOA board dissolved a week after the sentencing. The remaining members claimed they needed time to restructure, but the truth was obvious. Their silence during Karen's reign made them complicit. They hadn't cut the wires, but they had allowed the kind of environment where that could happen unchecked. They hadn't protected the community. They'd just enforced its submission. The vacuum they left behind might have scared some people, but to me, it felt like oxygen, real, clean, and finally mine to breathe freely. What rose in its place was something I never expected: connection. Small, local groups started forming organically. Not official committees or power-hungry boards, just people who wanted to make the neighborhood safe again for everyone. A woman named Teresa, who lived 2 doors down and used a cane after a car accident, started a group for medically vulnerable residents. They went door to door, cataloging who might need help during outages, who had generators, and who had medical equipment that required consistent power. We created a buddy system, neighbors helping neighbors. No fines, no inspections, just care. Despite that comfort, I kept a low profile until I was contacted by a civic group in the next town over. They'd read about my case and asked me to speak at a community awareness event about HOA overreach. At first, I said no. Public speaking wasn't in my nature, and I didn't want to relive what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence was how people like Karen thrive. They count on victims being too tired, too scared, or too ashamed to speak. And maybe that was exactly why I had to say yes. When the day came, I stood in front of a small but packed room. Folding chairs filled with homeowners, elderly couples, parents of disabled kids, and young people who had just bought their first homes and wanted to understand what they were signing up for. My voice shook at first. I didn't tell them everything. Not about the darkest moments or how close I'd come to giving up, but I told them enough. I told them about the generator, about the power being cut, about how it felt to wake up and wonder if someone had just tried to kill you, all because they didn't like how your house looked. And I told them about the silence that followed, the neighbors who saw but said nothing, the HOA board that ignored medical exemptions, the fear, the fragility, the helplessness. But I didn't stop there. I told them what happened after, about Joel, about the soup, about the neighborhood that slowly started to feel like home. I told them that justice wasn't just Karen going to jail. It was the way we rose from it, the way we chose to rebuild, not just with policy, but with humanity. After that, everything snowballed. The story gained local media traction. A few news stations wanted interviews. I kept it respectful, not because Karen deserved kindness, but because anger had already taken so much from me. I wasn't going to let it define what came next. My case was cited in a policy brief presented at a statewide HOA reform hearing. One councilwoman even drafted legislation to protect residents who rely on medical equipment, making it illegal for any HOA to obstruct medically necessary installations. When the bill passed, she reached out to thank me. She said my story had put a face to the issue. I didn't want to be the face of anything. But if it meant fewer people suffering in silence, if it meant one less Karen could ruin a life, then I would keep showing up. Back at Willow Creek, life continued. Karen moved out a month after finishing her sentence. Her house sat empty for a while, then quietly sold to a young family who planted sunflowers in the front yard. They didn't put up fences. They hosted cookouts and invited everyone, even me. I went eventually. I brought a pie. It was the first time in years that laughter drifted across the lawns without someone watching, reporting, or judging. One of the proudest moments came when the neighborhood voted unanimously to eliminate every bylaw Karen had ever pushed through. No more citations for decorative lights. No more restrictions on garden styles. No more punishment for wind chimes, ramp installations, or kids playing too loudly. We weren't just removing her. We were unlearning her. There was one meeting where we officially renamed the HOA. It wasn't just symbolic. We changed its function entirely. It became a voluntary neighborhood council, focused solely on safety, access, and equity. No fines, no surveillance, just mutual respect and transparent discussion. They asked me to serve as the first rotating chairperson. I declined at first, still unsure if I was ready to be in the middle of it all. But after a few weeks, I accepted, not because I wanted control, but because I finally understood what real stewardship looked like. And I wanted to help others see it too. Healing came slowly, but it came. My sleep returned. The flinching stopped. I walked more, laughed more, spoke more freely. The house, once a space of recovery and caution, became something else entirely. Home, not a hiding place, not a cage watched over by HOA vultures, but mine, safe, still, uncontested. I remember walking out one morning and seeing a group of kids riding bikes. One of them had a little speaker tied to his handlebar, blasting music. The kind of thing Karen would have found in a heartbeat. I stood there, smiling, watching them loop around chalk drawings that covered the pavement in front of my driveway. One of the kids pointed at my house and said, "That's the guy who stood up to the crazy lady." His friend asked, "Did he win?" And the first boy said, "Yeah." He didn't even yell. He just stood there until everything changed. That night, I sat on my porch long after the sun went down. Not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as someone who had been tested by the quiet brutality of control, and who answered, not with rage, but with presence. I had been the man she couldn't silence. And that, in the end, was enough.